On Freedom's Call, cooperation between Jewish and African American communities in Washington, D.C. by Shira, Destinie, Jones, Landrac, dedicated to Antoinette L. Bork and Dr. Edgar Kahn. A bridge between economics and spirituality. That is how Dr. Edgar Kahn, co-author of The War on Poverty, A Civilian Perspective and inventor of time banking, characterizes his new social structure dedicated to system change. That is also what this book hopes to inspire, the building of more bridges between social economics and with spirituality, starting with my community of origin and my spiritual community of choice. My family, Black DC residents for 5 generations on each side, is an intimate part of DC's African American community, singing and worshiping at Mount Zion, UMC, St. Augustine's, and St. Luke's. We also form part of the history of Black-Jewish community cooperation in the city, back to my adoptive great-grandfather, Adolphus Johnson, who worked as head tailor at Kahn's department store for many years, Kahn's as they used to pronounce it. My mother, Antoinette Bork, shares recollections of Jewish shop owners, Rose and Herman Gerber, who ran a small store on the corner near her home at 1905 Lincoln Road, NE. The Gerbers and other Jewish-owned shops like that on the corner of 10th and O Street and W frequently extended credit to their colored customers. And starting at Calvin Coolidge Senior High School in 1964 with classmates from the Hebrew Academy, my mother also recalls about Jewish culture and sharing diverse heritages in that tense decade after desegregation. At about the same time, in the same city yet another world away, Dr. S. Jean and Edgar Kahn were pioneering Black-Jewish cooperation on the social and legal fronts. Both DC families, old and new, drew on the faith which had them kept going and used that faith to inspire hope in a new generation which took up the torch to carry on the struggle to light the lamp of cooperation across yet more communities. Notes. This book will use the terms colored, Negro, Black, and African American interchangeably depending on the time frame under discussion. This refers to the terms which were in use during the periods in question. Also, the term community cooperation will be defined here as institutional groups such as religious and community-based organizations which bring people in the aggregate together to cooperate or act together collectively rather than simply on the individual level. Chapter 1. Shared oppression, shared cultures, shared resistance. Shared history of oppression. You accepted 400 years of oppression. I have just accepted 3,000 years of oppression. From African American Dr. Jean Kahn, upon converting to Judaism by permission E. Kahn. The rabbis say that it took one man plunging into the sea and wading in up to his neck before the waters parted as the children of Israel were finally able to be free. As Moses had led the Hebrew slaves out of the land of Egypt up and out of bondage, so the Negro slaves took to their faith even as the spiritual waters of oppression seemed to rise up to the necks of people of color, both free and enslaved. People of color formed communities in spite of the oppressive atmosphere, overcoming great prejudice to do so, as mistrusted and often denigrated Jewish citizens also had to do. from Benjamin Banneker in 1791 to Isaac Pollock in 1795, the first non-white residents of the city faced unique challenges, having to prove themselves to their white contemporaries. In 1850, abolitionists and free people of color advocated for the rights of slaves, while Captain Jonas P. Levy and the Sons of Israel fraternal members had to advocate for the rights of Jews overlooked in our very own treaties. Just as free individuals and families of color formed connections in the capital, as with Georgetown businessman Moses Zachariah Booth in 1865, and the Nash and Mayo families from Virginia at the turn of the 20th century, so Jewish businessmen and families trickled into the city before and poured in during the Civil War, as with Cantor Lansbury from Baltimore in 1860 and the small family at the turn of the 20th century. Thus, there are multiple parallels in the ways that the Jewish and black communities, both enslaved as well as free people of their color, had to cope with life in a country where neither was recognized as fully equal by the white majority. By the time the first Hebrew congregation in Washington City is organizing in 1852, thus present at least as early as 1850, slave couples are still passing at night down 7th Street. The groans of slaves from the nearby D.C. City Jail, long used as a federally subsidized slave pen, still echo from the corner of 4th and G Street NW, where the first Jewish residents might have passed going about their day. Those sounds may have been particularly poignant in 1851 as the Fugitive Slave Act came into effect. The act stopped the slave couples, but in exchange required the active participation of all free citizens in apprehension and return of runaway slaves. As they listened to the Torah being read in private homes, in store fronts along 7th Street, or even southwest near the wharf, the destination of those enchained human beings, did they recall those sounds of suffering? What conflicts may this have raised in the minds of observant Jews? They were barely accepted themselves in this southern city, where the community felt obliged to petition for permission to purchase a house of worship, despite the existence of St. John's and other prominent Christian houses of worship. What fear and guilt may have gone through the minds of those hearing the words of Parshat Ki Tetzei, Deuteronomy 23:16, commanding that a slave running away from a harsh master must be allowed to live wherever he wished and not oppressed. Here in Washington, D.C., the compensated emancipation, which conditionally freed slaves 9 months before the Emancipation Proclamation, left many slaves waiting for freedom, continuing to hope for a Moses of their own, as Harriet Tubman was sometimes called. The well-known comparison actually went both ways, as Negro slaves identified with the plight of the Hebrews enslaved in Egypt and many Jewish families in Mississippi and other areas of the South controlled by General Grant's troops experienced a homelessness similar to their recently enslaved contemporaries. Runaway slaves crossing Union lines were known as contrabands, considered to be confiscated contraband property of war. While Jews were being expelled from their homes in areas occupied by General Grant's troops, people of color like Harriet and Louisa Jacobs in the federal city and surrounding areas worked to inspire hope and provide housing for the many contrabands pouring into the capital from the south. And ironic twist of fate in the history of these two oppressed peoples. History was not all they shared.